Hello, and welcome to another edition of Brussels Sprouts. I'm Andrea Kendall-Taylor.
And I'm Jim Townsend.
And we're so glad you could join us. Since the war in Ukraine began, the European Union has provided substantial military support to Kyiv. This includes over 6 billion euros from the bloc's dedicated weapons fund, in addition to the 37.4 billion euros provided by EU member states. The EU military assistance mission has also trained 60,000 Ukrainian soldiers since 2022. Yet years of underinvestment and a lack of coordination mean that Europe's defense industrial base has struggled to keep up with demand. While there is a renewed sense of urgency to tackle this issue, in September, NATO's outgoing Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg warned against EU defense efforts duplicating or competing with NATO, given scarce funding and personnel. What is the role of the EU when it comes to defense issues? Does the EU have a role in supporting the development of the defense industrial base? And how can EU and NATO efforts to support Ukraine be mutually supporting rather than cut across each other? To discuss these questions and more, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Benedikta von Seherr-Thoss and Max Bergmann on today's podcast. Welcome to you both.
Great to be with you.
Quick introductions. Benedikta is the Managing Director for Peace, Security, and Defense at the European External Action Service. And Max is the Director of the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program and the Stewart Center in Euro-Atlantic and Northern European Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS. Okay, so Benedikta, maybe I'll start with you, but Max, I know this is going to be something you're going to want to weigh in on too. We've been having this discussion about the EU's role in European security and fostering greater EU-NATO cooperation for a very long time. I wonder, Benedikta, if you can just start with kind of the long arc of this story. Like, how would you characterize where we've been and where we are now?
The long arc of the story, I will try to keep it as short as possible, but of course, so much has changed in the past few years, right? We have come from, as you say, from decades of underinvestment of Europe, feeling very comfortable in its own region and on its own continent, knowing NATO is there, knowing the US is there, and definitely not doing enough. We have had wake-up calls in 2016, 17, and that's why Europe really started to build its own different defense instruments and initiatives. So we had the European Defence Fund, for example, to encourage joint production or procurement and development of products. We have joint planning. We have another program that enhances cooperation, the PESCO. So we have tried to build the cooperation amongst Europeans in a much better way to basically make Europe stronger and help Europe live up to its task. But that has changed again completely in February 2022 when with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the EU's reaction to it, which has, I think no one has really seen this coming. I think the EU's reaction to the war in Ukraine has been a complete game changer. You mentioned the numbers at the beginning. We have now provided support worth more than $128 billion to Ukraine, and 48 billion of that is military capabilities, trained 60,000 soldiers. We have a new target of 75,000 soldiers. So really that is a complete game changer. And I think no one would have thought only a few years ago that the EU would support financially and in lots of other ways the provision of weapons to a country at war. So I think that the nature of our work has changed. And then we have realized, as I think also the US has done, or NATO in general has done, that we don't have enough capabilities, of supplying Ukraine, but also of defending Europe. So we have started developing programs to ramp up European industry. And we have since then tried to combine them in one big strategy, which is the European Defence Industrial Strategy that we have published in March and which we are now about to implement. So. There's more to say, but I stop here for now.
No, that's great. And we'll pick up a lot of those threads. But Max, I know you're going to want to kind of weigh in. What would you add?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll take
for a long time. So, but
yeah, maybe I could go on and on, but maybe I'll just sort of bigger picture. I just think for the last 25 years or so, we've been worried about the wrong duplication. And it's the EU and NATO. Oh my God, they're going to duplicate each other. When you look at member states, European member states, and what you see are, just a ton of duplication and lack of coordination. And the end result is that European defense is a total mess. I'm oftentimes described as sort of Pollyannish about the European Union. And I would sort of counter, maybe I'm just more pessimistic about the potential for European member states to actually live up to their defense responsibilities. And that even if they, spend 2%, and it's just not going to be enough to actually secure Europe. And that what we're talking about is European security, not the security of Belgium or the Netherlands or individual European states, but how all these countries then fit together to then fight. And that's NATO's job in some ways, is to coordinate that. But NATO is premised with the US sort of being the lead role. And I think it's really important for the Europeans, and I think this is where the EU can really play this role, to help integrate and coordinate. And that's what the EU does, is integrate. And when we look at the defense industrial base, and you have all these 27 different, Pentagons and defense ministries and defense industrial complexes that aren't that integrated, or not as integrated, frankly, as they should be, it's a real mess. And so I think, Jens Stoltenberg has been a fantastic Secretary of Defense, but I think this has been a real blind spot. And I think partly being Norwegian, coming from the kind of center left party that is the Eurosceptic party in Norway, hasn't been that helpful. And I think Mark Rutte and had just met with Ursula von der Leyen, and I think that's a really important signal that hopefully we can just turn the page on this really petty bureaucratic infighting that reminds me when I was at the State Department and would have to fight with Jim, over DoD authorities and other petty issues that are important to us bureaucrats when we're in there, but actually in the grand scheme of things may not matter as much.
Hey, this is Jim Townsend. I agree with both of what you all are saying, and I was really anxious to jump in on this particular issue because first of all, in terms of duplication, that whole word duplication and the reason it even came up was from an issue back in the early 2000s where the EU was looking at setting up a headquarters that was going to be a duplication of shape. And so what NATO was concerned about was duplicating shape and an EU version of shape in Tervuren. They even had a building for it. That's what it was. And it just grew into this, it got caught up in the rhetoric of that period where there were EU haters in Washington and they were US/NATO haters in some European capitals, the Chocolate Summit, if you remember those days. And it got caught up. And so the whole reason about the concern about duplication was lost. So, Max, what you said is exactly right. And I think we've reached a point, and which is my major point right now for this podcast is, I'm a defense planner from NATO. I ran the defense planning for the U.S. there. I was the U.S. defense planner at NATO. So I know how defense planning works. I know how NATO does it. I know how the EU does it too, because they're different, but they do defense planning, but they do it in a different way. I think what will help us now, and the time has come to do it this way, is for the EU and for NATO to do defense planning together. Right now, the NATO will say, well, we've got EU people who are observers. They come to our meetings. NATO people go downtown to the EU. They go to those meetings. Those days are over. Those were Band-Aids over the problem. We will never get out of this problem that Max just described so well. We'll never get out of this unless an EU-NATO country understands on one sheet of paper what NATO would like for that NATO member to do and what the EU would like to request as a volunteer or whatever the EU wants to phrase it, that the EU wants that country to be able to do. So it's on one sheet of paper what the expectations are of both institutions. And that gives the EU an ability to go to that member and say, look, We see what both institutions have laid out that they are expecting from you over time in terms of capability. Let us, the EU, help you get there, whether it's through the EDA, whether it's through the funding mechanisms, whether it's through PESCO, whether, using the card system. The EU already has the card system, which is similar to the NATO system in terms of defense planning, but it gives that country an ability to understand what's expected and the ability to go to the EU or NATO as appropriate for the assistance to help them get there. Joint procurement. NATO does joint procurement, which makes it, for that bundles countries that are looking for the same thing, like 155 millimeter ammo. They buy it together at a cheaper price. Okay, so that cannot happen unless we're more organized and we're more cooperative in terms of what we're asking each to do. You keep the sovereignty of both institutions. All that BS politics that came up in the early 2000s, put that aside. We're going to have to cut a deal with Turkey on this too. I know that, but let's put that aside. The point is, we have reached a point in this crisis that we have where we will never get Europe able to break its dependency on the United States unless the EU can go in and help these EU NATO members reach the capability requirements that NATO and the EU have leveraged on that country. We can also make sure that the EU isn't leveraging one thing on a country and the NATO another thing that are incompatible. We can do it in an organized, integrated fashion. And then the country will have access to tools within the EU and within NATO to help them get to where they're going. Right now, it's a shit show. And it can be done in a better way if both institutions sit down at the table and do it together, not as observers, but as actual compatriots working together to put together what the requirements are for each country.
Isn't it great to have Jim back? Respond, react, Benedikta. How does that sound from your purview? Max, then over to you. I mean, that Jim put a lot on the table, but coming from Brussels, does that sound crazy? Are things moving in that direction? I don't know. Give us a sense of your reaction, Benedikta.
I think you really put it very well. I think that's exactly what we need to do. I think it's really not time for ideological differences. So we need to be very pragmatic. We both have a huge problem, right? We have a huge problem for European security, for transatlantic security. We have a revisionist Russia. We have a growing alliance of Russia, China, Iran, DPRK. So we are facing adversaries that are very well organized. And I think we need to ensure that we have enough capabilities in place and that we are organized in a way that we can defend ourselves. So I think that we should not look a bit at problems amongst us, but that we should get together to fight the problems outside the transatlantic area. So that's the first part. There are, of course, important things that we need to do. I think we need to acknowledge that we both have the same problems. NATO allies currently cannot achieve NATO capability targets, for example. So we don't have enough capabilities in NATO in Europe. We also the capabilities that we have don't speak to each other enough. So we have a lack of interoperability. So with this, we come to the problem of standardization, for example. So I think that we need to use these two organizations to throw every solution at the problem that we have. And I think they come from very different perspectives, right? The EU will never try to be a military alliance. That's NATO. NATO is doing territorial defense and deterrence. What the EU is doing is it has its regulatory power. It has its budgetary power. So it can bring a lot to the table to help fill these gaps. Like, for example, when we look at of course, we need to join to coordinate the planning more closely. I think that's the first one, because we need to invest in exactly the same gaps. We need to ensure that we stick to the standards. The EU is very good at standardization. then I think one very good example is military mobility, right? Where the EU has used NATO standards and requirements and put EU regulations and money to it so that troops and equipment can cross Europe as quickly as possible. It's a win-win for all sides. So I think that's one project that we should duplicate in lots of different areas. So invest in the same gaps and put the funding. I mean, we have a single set of forces, the 23 allies who are also members of the European Union. So we need to make sure that we work in the same direction. Of course, there are the political problems that Jim mentioned. So I think they will stay to some extent, and we need to see how can we be pragmatic, how can we make progress. For example, one big aspect is the exchange of classified information, because in order to for example, be more to do the planning together, we need to have also standardization. We need to be able to exchange information. So we need to know what are the standards in order to help the EU member states who are also NATO allies implement them. So I think everyone has understood we need to do a lot. We have new leaderships on both sides, NATO and soon also EU. It's always a good opportunity to have to deepen the relationship, and I think that's exactly what the leadership will do.
Yeah, if I could just add, I think there's been a real shift in Washington how we view the European Union and NATO in response to the war in Ukraine. And I kind of think what happened is that during the 1990s we weren't quite sure about what our future role in NATO was. We weren't quite sure where the Europeans were headed. We were the world was in some ways great, from a Washington perspective, because it was our unipolar moment. On the other hand, what happened was that we were very kind of insecure about where we were going to end up. And so NATO, we made a policy decision that no, we wanted to stay in NATO. I think that made a ton of sense. But we were nervous that the EU would sort of run in a different direction. And it was the era of foreign interventions. And so we were worried, well, we were going to do NATO would do an intervention in maybe, the Balkans or in Africa. And then suddenly the EU would want to do an intervention elsewhere, but they didn't have the forces. And it would create all this kind of really confusing duplication. I think we're really beyond that conceptually. And I think what happened is that the duplication thing just got set in stone post 9/11, and we never really revisited. So what happened after the war in Ukraine is we then have been really open to, it's a crisis situation, and suddenly the EU has all these tools. And so you're seeing this sort of softening of the US stance toward the EU doing more in defense, which I think is really important. And I think there's now a clear potential division of labor. Where NATO, in some respects, is like the combatant command. They're the ones doing the war fighting. They're the ones that are planning for territorial defense and thinking about that, and will be running the war. But if you think about the Pentagon, that's not, the Pentagon is doing the back office stuff, is helping with the procurements and force readiness and making sure that there aren't clear gaps across the force. And that, in some ways, is NATO's role. But really, what we've seen is that NATO isn't really that well equipped to do that. I think that's where NATO falls down, because it doesn't really have a budget. It's a multilateral organization that doesn't quite have the same forcing functions and power that the European Union has. So what the EU brings to the table, it's got a much bigger budget. It's not huge, but it's got a much bigger budget. It has this thing called the euro, a currency, which, if the European Union woke up and realized that you could leverage this currency to really generate a lot of financing and funding for defense, that would be quite potent. But it has this regulatory capacity that Benedikta has talked about. And it also does something that NATO doesn't really do, and that no other European countries really do, is it thinks about the union. It thinks about where are Europe's collective gaps. And oftentimes NATO may not have a gap because the United States is filling it, but Europe has a gap. And if there is a situation in the Indo-Pacific and suddenly the United States isn't quite there, well, maybe NATO is not calculating that, but that's what Europe can do. And maybe, lastly, well, while, NATO's role, I think, is clearly now in deterring Russia, in preparing Europe to hold off the Russians and to deter the Russian threat, Europe faces a lot of instability along its southern periphery in the Middle East. And, you constantly hear Southern European countries at NATO saying, well, what about the southern flank? NATO should focus on that. And the reality is, like, NATO is just not really going to care that much, in part because the United States isn't going to care that much. The United States wasn't in the Sahel with the European Union fighting alongside. I mean, we had some force presence, but it wasn't a NATO mission because we didn't prioritize it as the United States. And so what we're looking at is a situation where Europe's national security priorities are not necessarily exactly the same as the United States. And we can't really, it's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's just the reality. And so there may be a role for the EU also, and the EU has done missions to develop that capacity as well. And that doesn't mean that, like duplication, oh my God, what do we do? Well, we talk about it and we figure it out and you work through it. So I think where we're at is probably a much more mature place than where we were a number of years ago. And hopefully that means the EU can continue to build off what it's been doing.
Great. Well, we lost Jim to an event at Hudson, but we'll march on with this conversation in his absence. But I think Jim and then Benedikta and you, Max, have all laid out, like, I think a very compelling case. And it seems like there's a good deal of consensus among the group that the EU is ready and should and needs to play a bigger role in European defense. Why hasn't it so far? I mean, again, I just go back to this idea, this point that we've been talking about this for such a very long time. And so, Benedikta, what do you see as the key barriers or the headwinds to the EU playing the role that you all have discussed?
I think it always starts with awareness, and with awareness comes political will. I think we have seen some changes, as I said, around 2017, and then we have seen massive changes with the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And this is when the Zeitenwende started, where much more was possible in terms of the delivery of military equipment to Ukraine, training of Ukrainians, but also investment in national defense budgets. So we just had the latest reports from the EU, and we see that the projection for defense spending for 2024 is estimated $352 billion, which is an increase of 30% compared to 2021, which shows that European member states have really woken up to the fact that they need to invest much more in defense. So many defense budgets have really gone up. The same with the investment within the defense spending. So I think there is a lot of awareness that we need to do more, but we also we still need to put the structures in place to do it jointly, because one thing is to spend money, but another thing is to spend it wisely and to spend it together. And you talked at the beginning about the fact that the EU doesn't just have one. It doesn't have one Pentagon. It has 27 Pentagons, 27 armies, 27 procurement agencies, etc., etc. So we need to organize ourselves in a much better way. And I think what is very important is the structures. We have put many of them in place, but I think we also need funding also at the European level. And I think that with funding, that is always a game changer. And Max, you said that the EU budgets are something that NATO doesn't have, and where the EU clearly has something to bring to the table. And I think that this will be a priority of the next Commission to be able to finalize the structures to ensure that we have adequate funding, and then also to see what are the projects that we need to invest in. And that shows again, the projects, and that shows again that we need to have a close coordination between NATO and the EU, because we need to ensure that we fill the critical capability gaps that we both see. But I think it's a little bit broader than that, because we also need to be able to organize ourselves in a good way. That means that you said what are the barriers, what keeps us from it. One thing, for example, is access to private money. We have the European Investment Bank, and it's very important that it changes its lending policy in a way that it facilitates access to public financing of in banks in the member states, because at the moment it's hard for defense companies to get this funding. And we have learned, of course, that every war has a big economic angle, and we need the companies in order to produce the products that we need to defend ourselves. So that's one very important element. I think what we also need, and with this I'm looking to NATO and I'm looking to the US, we need the US to acknowledge that it needs Europe to be a strong partner. And to be a strong partner, it needs to allow Europe to organize itself. And yes, it's true. We have seen, we are in close touch with our American counterparts when it comes to the support of Ukraine, and we have really had a very, very close cooperation. But I think that it's the picture is much larger, and we have often seen, I would say, different approaches to Europe organizing itself, and there was also a lot of criticism from the American side, or a lot of concern that Europe might become too independent. But I think, again, we need to see what is the real problem. And I think the real problems are outside the transatlantic area. And we need to be as strong as possible in order to respond to support Ukraine, but then also be able to support wherever else it might be necessary in the future.
Yeah, Max, why don't you pick up on that piece on U.S. attitudes? Because we hear this constantly also, although I think, and you and I have had these conversations before, I think you and I are probably in agreement that U.S. attitudes have significantly changed.
Yeah, I have a very American-centric view and this, and maybe overstated, but that, we told the Europeans not to do this. We've told the EU, don't do this. I go back constantly to Madeleine Albright's famous 3Ds, sort of no duplication, no decoupling, no delinking speech that she gave at a NATO summit meeting in December of 1998. And it was just 4 days after the UK and France, Tony Blair and Jacques Chirac at Saint-Malo sort of held hands and declared that, we would create they would create a European rapid reaction force in the beginnings of sort of, EU defense integration. And then here was the US saying, no, don't do that.
But it's changed a lot, no?
No, it has, but until very recently. During the Trump administration, when PESCO and other EU funding initiatives were announced, Secretary of Defense Mattis said, don't do that. Why would you do that? There was a letter from the State Department and the Defense Department saying, how dare you? And so what we have told the Europeans over the last 20 years is get your act together on defense, spend more, but don't do it together. Don't integrate. My God, could you imagine, doing it through the EU? Oh, nightmare. And so what I think and why that's important is, of course, the Europeans could tell us to shove off. I mean, the French, we're trying to insist, let's tell the Americans to shove off. But, the UK was part of the European Union for a long time and very and sort of adopted our view as well. And if you're a Baltic state, independent on the United States for your security, and we are telling you don't do this through the EU, that is huge influence, and then that prevents anything from really happening. And what in some ways is sort of surprising is how much has actually happened at the European level despite US opposition. Maybe just a couple quick points.
Well, Max, I want you to let's talk about, though, how it's changed in the aftermath of the full-scale invasion. Because Tony Blinken I believe he was in Paris and made a statement, a speech that talked about U.S. desire to see Europe become a more capable partner. So, I mean, just talk for at least a second.
Yeah.
About your
no,
view
sure. What's interesting, if you go back and read some of the stuff that Tony Blinken has written before he became Secretary of State, I think 21 years ago he wrote something at Brookings saying maybe we should actually support EU defense initiatives. Is that I actually would point to AUKUS, and I think AUKUS was a wake up call in the fall of 2021, where suddenly huge French outrage And the administration kind of had to reckon with the fact that the French were saying, we want you to support EU defense efforts. And that introduced the subject. But then when you had the war kick off, what was happening was the US was working hand in glove with the European Union on sanctions. Then the EU suddenly had developed pre-war this thing called the European Peace Facility, which is EU security assistance, which then the EU was activating and putting lots of money. And so it's not so much that, we just decided that and we started pushing the EU, that in response to the war, the EU was doing all the stuff. And then we kind of have recognized that. And there was this period after the war where we were trying to sort of develop a US EU security dialogue. And Benedikta can maybe talk about this. Maybe she wants to avoid talking about this. And we put up this sort of roadblock of saying, well, we need to have this administrative arrangement between the European Defense Agency, which is about the size of CSIS, and the Pentagon. And it was, a long, complicated obstacle, but prevented dialogue. But that dialogue has now been created. And then in talking, you realize there's actually things that the EU is bringing to the table. And one of the things that I think I'm starting to see here in Washington is that actually other parts of the Pentagon, other parts of the State Department, other, the Asia bureaus recognize actually the EU could maybe play a role in security cooperation, in signaling to China, and in a way that takes the EU outside of just the European, the EUR bureau that is just really focused on kind of preserving NATO and still has this kind of legacy issue of the EU not playing a role in defense, and so that's slowly fading. But bureaucracies are kind of hard to transform. And maybe just one quick point is, to pick up on something Benedikta said, is that one of the reasons why it's really hard to change and to have the EU play a bigger role is not so much public views. What is sort of surprising is that if you look at European public opinion, it's sort of universal almost, but around 80% support the EU doing a lot more on defense in really bold proposals. And in fact, the European People's Party, which is Ursula von der Leyen's party, ran in the European parliamentary elections saying we need an EU defense, common defense. And that's really popular. So this whole notion of it has to be a national responsibility is actually not held by the public. What it's held by is the national bureaucracies. And so there's sort of this path dependency of iron triangles of national companies getting money from national ministries of defense not wanting to lose any power and control to Brussels. And so you're having a ton of just bureaucratic fights within the EU about national ministries of defense losing a degree of control. And that, that's in some ways understandable, but I think gets in the way of what would be a more efficient and effective European defense apparatus.
Benedikta, do you want to respond to anything there?
Yes, thank you very much. We have something called the Schumann Forum, which is a conference that we organize this year. About 600 people took part, and it brings all the partners of the EU together in Brussels, so global partners. And we had different panels, and in one panel, someone said, we need to figure out who you are, because we know you in the context of trade, but we don't know you in the context of security and defense. So you've become a new animal, and we need to figure out who exactly you are. And I think that that is understandable to some extent, because I think, as I said at the beginning, the support to Ukraine really has changed the EU's role so much when it comes to security and defense, not just the support itself, but also the way in which we have restructured our own initiatives and try to organize ourselves. And I think, of course, we need to explain it very well. But we see that this has also led to many countries being very interested in cooperating with the EU. So we have seen, for example, many Indo-Pacific countries come to the EU and say, can we please cooperate more closely? The same goes for, of course, other countries within Europe, also on the South American side. So as the EU is changing and is taking on a more important role in defense and is becoming a more serious and recognized security provider. And I'm not talking about sending big armies somewhere, but I'm talking about being a smart enabler and being able to support in lots of different ways, because of course the threats are so diverse. And we have cooperation when it comes, for example, to the fields of cyber, of information manipulation, so FIMI, of counterterrorism, of space also. Industry is, of course, an important field. So there's so much that we are discovering ourselves, but also our partners are discovering. So I think it's a general trend, and we are putting a lot of effort into deepening relationships, into tailoring the relationships where it helps the partners, where it helps us, and where we can together advance our interests and also values. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit later, but since I think we are really in a fight about maintaining the international rules-based order and the open free societies as we know them, we need to have as many partners as possible also on the multilateral field for all the negotiations that are going on there.
Okay, I want to do a little bit. So we've heard a lot of glass half full, and there is a very positive story, as I think you both have appropriately covered. But there's also maybe a glass half empty story also, which is we're now almost 3 years into the war in Ukraine, and very little has been done to actually stimulate the defense industrial base. There's been lots of positive announcements. I'm thinking of the creation of a new commissioner for the defense industry, although then people will say, on the other hand, that the role, responsibility, the kind of portfolio is particularly constrained. I guess, Benedikta, talk to me a little bit about, is it enough? Is the EU moving quickly enough, given that there's been a full-scale war in Europe for almost 3 years now? And I'll caveat, I think there's significant shortcomings in terms of what the US has done. So it's not like a relative thing. But if we're just talking about the EU itself, almost 3 years into the war in Ukraine, has the European Union moved quickly enough to organize and to do what is required, as you've adequately laid out, given the plethora of threats that the EU and the US face?
We said at the beginning, we had 30 years of underinvestment. We now have a war in Europe. We have global threats that are very diverse in nature, and we need to respond to all of them. So have we done enough? Definitely not. We still have a long way to go. We have done a lot, but I think we need to do much more. And that means we need to have adequate funding in place, and we also need to get much better at investing jointly. So of course it's cheaper if you don't do it 27 times, but ideally if you invest together. And I think that there we need to have still a change of mindset amongst member states. I think we need more funding, as we said, this, of course, also it's also the fact, how can we best support Ukraine?
Max, your views. I mean,
Yeah.
is it enough? And actually, I'd like to hear, and Benedikta, you can add to what Max says too. What do you think? Since February of 2022, what have been the successes within the EU on this piece of it? And then again, is it enough? I don't know. Is it enough?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. The answer is obviously no. But I think the EU, if we just look at the EU as an institution, not as a collective European Union, but the Commission and all the EU tools, it's been rather remarkable. Both, number one, on the sanctions side, number two, mobilizing a lot more, billions and billions of euros, more than 10 billion euros in the European Peace Facility, which is essentially incentivizes countries to give equipment to Ukraine. So it's basically member states give equipment to Ukraine, and then the EU pays them. That has been incredibly useful. But what we've actually seen is the limitations of Europe's aid to Ukraine is because it's being done at a national level. And what we're seeing are the weaknesses and limitations of European militaries, that they don't have a lot in stock given decades of underinvestment, and so they're giving away what they can. And then when it comes to ramping up defense industrial production, they're not yet coordinating. And this is where the EU has not been given this big pot of money to then say, okay, we're going to basically create our own European supplemental equivalent that is going to ramp up defense industrial production in a few of these areas and provide these kind of long-term contracts. You have all these countries doing their own thing. And some are, quite impressive. Germany has been quite impressive. Yet then Germany is blocking an effort to issue Eurobonds at the European level, which would then give the EU potentially this huge pot of money that it would then be able to replicate what we do here in the US, which is we create this big supplemental fund. We then pull some equipment from US stocks. We then go to industry or in this, or ourselves in the US Army and say, start producing 155 ammunition. And we've greatly expanded that. In Europe, the big companies are still waiting for these long-term contracts. And this is the problem with the defense industry. It's not like a normal commercial sector that just tries to meet demand because they only sell to governments. And so, not unreasonably, European defense companies are like, well, maybe they're not in this for the long haul. So what we have not seen is the EU mobilize the money collectively to really ramp up production that can be really helpful in aiding Ukraine. And so more than 2 years into the war, if the US has an election, coming up, and if we decide that we're not going to support Ukraine, Europe right now physically cannot replace us because they haven't ramped up haven't ramped up production that needed to really start 1 to 2 years ago. And that's, I think, a big shortfall.
One last issue that I want to pull on at the end of this conversation, but one just very quick factual question, Benedikta, for you. I think one thing that caught our attention, it was, as you mentioned, the new NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte met with von der Leyen. And one of the things that came out of that meeting, it sounded like, was an agreement to set up a new high-level task force to strengthen EU-NATO cooperation. Can you talk to us about what that is and what that might entail?
If I may, I would like to add something on the successes before, because I think that there really are a few. I think one of them is the successes vis-a-vis Ukraine, but then also in the way we organized ourselves, or at least, what we have already done, and I think what will also come as next steps. So I think that, we talked about the new role that the EU has taken on. I think that is personified or materialized in the European Peace Facility, this fund that grew from something around 5 billion to over 20 billion now, and most of it is spent on Ukraine. We have also started using the windfall profits of the frozen Russian assets, which was a huge step within Europe, and we are using this money to provide military equipment to Ukraine, but also to invest directly in Ukraine. So the EU has become the biggest investor in Ukrainian defense industry, and we have had a first payment of these windfall profits, but we are now preparing the second payment. And it's very important because it's so impressive to see what has happened on the Ukrainian side in terms of ramping up industry, in terms of driving innovation. If you look at the whole drone sector, for example, so we are supporting that with money from the windfall profits. It's also important that we integrate Ukraine successively into our defense industry. And in the defense industrial strategy that we have published in March, we said we will treat Ukraine almost like a member state. So, of course, Ukraine will join the EU eventually, and we need to ensure that we can integrate Ukraine, that we can also learn or profit from the lessons that Ukraine has learned. And at the same time, as we said now several times, we need to continue still to ramp up our own defense industry. We have done that a lot. When you look at ammunition, for example, we have greatly increase the production capacities. But we had recently the Draghi report, which also said that around 500 billion, and I think that's a conservative estimate, are needed to invest in defense in the EU. So we are still busy fixing errors of the past, but of course, at the same time, we need to prepare for the future, or actually the present. So I think there's a lot of awareness, and I think we have gone a long way already. But much more has to come. You asked me about the task force. Basically, it's very important, and I think that's what both the leadership, both Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, but also Mark Rutte as the new Secretary General, acknowledge. We need to work much more closely together, and this task force is a sign of that. And we will elaborate what exactly we will do, but we have a very active cooperation, and I think this will provide yet another push to the two institutions to work closely together.
Yeah. Okay. So last question, and I regret that it's taken so long for us to get here, but it's the issue of the Russia's hybrid warfare, for lack of a better term, the sabotage, derailing trains, setting fire to warehouses, all of these. I mean, it's been a massive uptick in the level of kind of direct action that Russia is taking inside EU member states. Can you talk to me, Benedikta, a little bit about the role that the EU sees itself as playing in this sphere? I mean, it is part of defense, but it is in many ways, or at least the response you could imagine taking place outside of NATO channels. And it seems to me that the EU could play a much more significant role in responding to what Russia is doing. I know there was a sanctions package mechanism that was put in place, which is a very positive step. But yeah, just talk to us a little bit about how this uptick in this quote unquote hybrid warfare is being discussed within the European Union.
So it's a huge topic for us. We have seen, as you said, an increase in the quality, but also in the quantity of the hybrid attacks across the full range. So it's something that we are taking very seriously. We have, many people say about the EU, oh, it's so complex and it's so hard to understand. But I think the beauty of the EU is that exactly that, because it means also it has an answer to every problem, and it can tackle the same problem from lots of different directions. And I think hybrid threats are a very good example, because we can, you mentioned the sanctions. So we can, of course, do sanctions. And you might have heard that just 2 weeks ago, we have created a new platform where it's possible to sanction individuals and institutions for hybrid threats. So that's also in addition. We have created what we call the diplomatic toolboxes. So that means that we are trying to respond to hybrid threats, and of course cyber threats are a very big part of that, in a coordinated way. We have established, for example, rapid response teams that member states that are affected, or also partners, can call on. So, for example, the cyber rapid response teams have supported Ukraine. They have supported Moldova. They have supported Mozambique. So we can send experts to member states or partners in need. We are also we are looking at the problem from lots of different ways. So we need to give practical support. We want to coordinate awareness. So we are creating more and more networks between the individual actors. So that goes for the cyber field, where we coordinate between the military networks. We have a very good dialogue between cyber ambassadors, between cyber commanders, for example. So it's a whole environment that we're looking at. So that's for shared awareness. But then we are also coordinating on lessons learned. We are also looking into the future about coordinating responses, so supporting the response of another member state, but then eventually also looking at shared responses. So again, many different steps. Many of them we have gone, but some of them remain to be done as well.
Yeah, I think one other area is really on the Intel side. The former Finnish president Niinisto was commissioned by Ursula von der Leyen to do a report on resilience. I think it has just emerged in Brussels today. Haven't been able to read it, but I see that there's a Politico headline saying that the report argues for the creation of a European CIA, essentially. But I, that may be a little bombastic, but from Politico. But essentially, it hits at a finer point of you have all these intelligence services that actually don't really coordinate that well. Don't share information that seamlessly. And there is a need for the EU to be very cognizant of what is happening inside the European Union when foreign actors are operating. And you have these issues of national governments not really wanting to share that information. And I think the way Americans should think about this is that the EU is sort of the federal responder. So there's, big floods in Spain, and the EU has essentially a FEMA-like mechanism to come in and provide support. And I think that in some ways is what is needed on the resilience side. And maybe just sort of one final thought on the kind of defense integration. Oftentimes it is suggested that the EU is going to create its own army, right? And it sort of becomes this red herring that, oh my God, what would that look like? And total nightmare. But what the EU does and how it integrates is it looks at where are the gaps, what are the problems, and so there's a huge shortfall in Europe's collective holdings of ammunition, for instance. Well, instead of each individual country trying to create their own stockpiles, the EU could do this themselves. The EU can, there's a gap in lift or air transport or air tankers or other things. The EU can fund that, missile defense, other areas where the EU can help come in and sort of fill the gaps that exist. And then what happens is that the EU, the way integration works, it does one thing and then another thing emerges and then it starts responding. And then lo and behold, the EU becomes this bigger federal actor for Europe collectively. And I think that's the process that needs to begin. Is what I would say. And that we're kind of at the beginning of what will be, I think, a very long process of integrating European defenses.
Well, this was a great conversation. The final point I'll make, Benedikta, is your point about collectivizing the response to hybrid and the role that the EU can play there. That's kind of been a pet project of mine or something that we've been thinking about at CNAS. So I think that's just such an important point because so long as it's each individual member states to respond, then the costs to Moscow are acceptable and they continue. So I hope you guys continue to push down that path of collectivizing the response. But all right. With that, we are at time, but really a huge thank you. And I know Jim would thank you as well. But Max, Benedikta, this has been really excellent. I learned a lot from this. And thank you very much for joining us.
Great to be with you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Brussels Sprouts, brought to you by the Transatlantic Security Team at the Center for a New American Security. You can find all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And please remember to rate and review Brussels Sprouts so that new listeners are able to find the show.